Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the next in this ongoing series of conversations on matters of global importance, global public policy, global human consciousness. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Pravin Krishna. Pravin is a professor, a distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, one of the premier schools of public policy in the world, where he holds an endowed chair, a named chair in trade and business. He's also cross-appointed to the economics department at Johns Hopkins. He's previously taught at Brown University. And I should also add that Pravin and I go back a long way. We were classmates in graduate school at Columbia, learning international trade with scholars like Jagdish Bhagwati, who in fact supervised both of our doctoral dissertations. Pravin has done important work on trade and multilateral versus preferential approaches to trade liberalization. He's done work on trade and inequality in India specifically, and really is perfectly poised to give us his take on the current debates in globalization and debates around economic reform and income, for instance, and wage inequality in India particularly, and the global south more generally. So it's a real pleasure to have him here today on the conversation. Welcome to the conversation, Pravin. It's great to have you on the show. And I've already given the viewers a basic intro to your background and your many accomplishments, so they know that. Pravin, in fact, I rewatched the conversation you and I taped live here at Carleton almost 10 or 12 years ago. At that point, you had done some new research investigating the link between freer trade in India when trade was liberalized, kind of post 1991 reforms. And to what extent did it or did it not have an effect on income inequality? But so with that, maybe as a starting point, but if I can just ask you a broader question, which is we've now had more than 3 decades since the 1991 reforms in India under successive governments of different political stripes. And so if you now look back on that period from 91 to the present, how would you take stock of that? I mean, one kind of simple way that one could look at it is that we had that initial kind of first generation reforms, the reforms of product markets under the Rao government, the Singh Rao reforms, whatever you want to call them. We had kind of a second burst of reforms under the Vajpayee government. And then one view would be that in the kind of the long 10 years of the Singh premiership, there was a shift away from conventional reforms toward what you might call social welfare, to entitlement-based welfare schemes. That was the time of the great Bhagwati versus Sen debate, which you will recall. And now we've had 9 years of the Modi government with different kinds of reforms that they've tried to do. So let me ask you just to reflect broadly on kind of 3 decades of reforms and what that means for India.
Great. Well, thank you, Vivek. A real pleasure to be on your show. And indeed, so it's been 3 decades since the reforms began. And for me, the question of for economists often is, did this particular reform lead to that particular outcome, or was it an economic reform or social policy reform and so on? Let's set that aside for a moment, right? And simply maybe think about what's the overall record in terms of what's been achieved, what are the pluses, and maybe what are some minuses here. So overall, I think without a doubt, average incomes have gone up a lot. Without a doubt, there's been a rather dramatic reduction in poverty. I think without a doubt, that reduction in poverty is not concentrated among just a few sections of society, a particular religion or a caste or anything of that nature. Studies looking across different states, across different religious groups, across different income groups, and so on, generally will show you that poverty has declined, right? And quite dramatically in many instances, so meaning within many social groups. the question of whether inequality itself has gone up or not, some part of that has to do with what's going on at the very top end of the income distribution. Generally hard to observe because your regular income surveys and the kinds of things that government officers are able to do in terms of getting income statistics from the top end of the income distribution is a little harder to tell, right? But in the Indian context, and given the recent history of the last 3 decades or so, I would say maybe we shouldn't worry too much about, what from the standpoint of understanding the overall impact on the poor, on reduction in poverty, and so on. Maybe looking at what's happened, the bottom 90% of the income distribution is sufficient, whether an Ambani has gotten much richer than he was before or not, is an interesting question. And if one accurately wanted to compute sort of income inequality statistics, we would need to include all of these individuals in there. But setting that aside, I think the record has been a very solid one from the standpoint of income growth as far and as well as poverty reduction. Alongside that, and you made reference to kind of economic reforms and then kind of track to education, health, and so on. The record has been reasonably good there as well in the following sense, at least for health. When you look at basic health indicators, the question of whether life expectancy has gone up, whether infant mortality rates have gone down, and so on and so forth. I think the record is a kind of a reassuring one. Things are looking up. The numbers are all moving in the right direction. From an education standpoint, I fear that maybe that is not the case as much. The data are indicating that maybe there's been some progress, but less than what one might have expected, at least at kind of a broad national scale, after 30 years of pretty solid reform and 30 years of some level of income growth, right? So overall, for me, the pluses are very clearly average incomes rising, poverty declining, social indicators sort of improved, right? Health and so on. If you push that issue a little further and say, did the reforms yield everything that we had hoped for? Have they put us in a place where we could be competitive today with China as a kind of a manufacturing platform, exporting goods to the rest of the world? And if not, why not? So that question, I think, generates more questions, right? So that raises difficult questions for the Indian economy, for our record over the last 30 years. So the fact of the matter is that despite reforms, despite impressive reforms, the share of the Indian workforce that's in manufacturing has really not gone up by that much in the last 30 years, right? And so from any kind of standard economic logic sort of perspective, anyone, you or I would have forecast 30 years ago that this type of liberalization would help, would push low-skill Indian workers into manufacturing, incentivize them to enter manufacturing. We would be a more productive place. We'd be able to export to the rest of the world and so on. And that simply has not happened, at least nowhere near, in magnitude, the scale to which one might have hoped for, and nowhere near where it needs to be in order for India to achieve anything like the type of economic growth or economic transformation that China has achieved, right? So you still have about 50% of the workforce, maybe a little less, employed in agriculture. You've seen some transition away from the agricultural sector into services, but for most part, these have been sort of low productivity, low skilled services. And there's a question of whether that is the type of change that's the type of structural transformation we want, or that's the type of structural transformation that's going to propel India into the next level. So for me, the broad question of kind of the broad orientation of the economy, where we ought to be, where we really by now should have been much more competitive in manufacturing, much more able to export to the rest of the world, we're not quite there yet, right? And even in the more recent years, as you've seen other reforms with infrastructure investments undertaken by the government, but really from an anecdotal standpoint or a standpoint of personal experience, you travel to India, you do see these improvements. You do see greater efficiency in transport and so on and so forth. That still has not resulted in the type of shift in manufacturing that one had hoped for. I should add that the kinds of reforms that economists were advocating, people like you and me and various others, Arvind Panagaria most notably, Jagdish Bhagwati and so on, about sort of reforms on the side of the labor markets, things that would enable India to become a better place to do business. Some of this has actually been done. It's been done steadily, maybe not quite as dramatically as one had hoped for, but still, labor regulations have been relaxed a bit, infrastructure has improved, bureaucracy has been sort of decreased the bureaucratic burden in getting businesses started and so on. And still, we don't have the kind of change that we need. Now, there's a kind of a demographic pressure in India, which is well known to everybody. A very young population entering the labor force in large numbers every year. The expectation of the Modi government that maybe they would be able to create the kinds of jobs in the numbers, 10 million jobs a year, I think it was the number that was bandied about a decade ago. I don't think we've seen that type of job growth take place. We certainly haven't seen it in manufacturing, and the economy doesn't seem to be responding in that direction, despite the reforms that were undertaken that we would have hoped would sort of nudge it there, if not really accelerate the path into manufacturing. So we're left with a bit of a conundrum still with the Indian economy. Just to summarize it, the challenge, which is that you have a large population of low-skilled workers. These are not the workers that could be going into the IT sector and servicing companies like Google and Microsoft and so on, which is where India seems to have gained its fame in terms of the exports over the last couple of decades, right? And so if low-skilled Indian workers cannot go to those sectors and they cannot go into service sectors that require higher skill, where should they go? Where can they go? Or will they just be stuck in the agricultural sector and we continue very gradually on the path, the not so satisfactory path that we've been on with respect to the structural transformation? So that for me is the big question that the economy still faces.
Thank you for that. And there's so much there to unpack, but in the interest of time, let me just ask you one follow-up on that, Pravin. I mean, like we could have talked about inequality, about spatial inequality, something that I've worked on, but let's focus on this real paradox or conundrum, as you say, that India's growth has been very different from that of other growth miracles, going back to Germany and Japan after the war, going back to East Asia, and of course, obviously China, which has become the factory of the world, that India growth has not, as you say, been driven by large-scale labor-intensive manufacturing. Some people have called it jobless growth, not literally jobless, but the kind of a low elasticity of sort of labor with respect to India's growth. And so the conventional view is, and I think that it's a view that you and I have certainly articulated, that this is not going to be sustainable in the long run, given the demographic pressure, as you've observed. As you said, the old number that was bandied about was 1 million new workers every month, 10 to 12 every year, and that presumably only increased, given that India is now the world's largest population. Now, there is a contrarian view, and there's a new book by Raghuram Rajan, which you probably heard of, which he co-wrote with Rohit Lamba, called, I think, Breaking the Mold. I've not yet read the book, and I'm in fact hoping to have him or them on the show at some point. But from what I've gathered, just from reading about the book and what a couple of podcasts that Raghu and Rohit did, they seem to be arguing that there's some kind of unique Indian pathway towards sustained higher growth, and it's not going to come through manufacturing. That ship has sailed. Global supply chains are now entrenched. Yes, some are moving away from China. I mean, we'll talk about the global kind of context later, but that somehow it'll be powered by services. And now because I should say I've not read the book or in their arguments in detail, and I'm hoping to, as I say, to have them on the show, but at first glance, that I'm kind of skeptical of that idea that somehow India can keep growing and absorb so much new labor into services. Not everyone can become a Google engineer or Infosys engineer, and that's a relatively small number of skilled workers. And otherwise, the jobs and skilled services kind of the kind of old-fashioned flipping burgers and making vada pav and so on at a food stand. Very low productivity, and how many workers can be gainfully employed, and they're certainly not what we would call good jobs. So, if you can just reflect briefly, what do you think of, say, of this contrarian idea? I don't know if you read the book, or you know what they're getting at. But what's your sense that India can have this alternative kind of uniquely Indian path towards growth that does not depend so much on manufacturing?
Yeah, so my take on it is on the one hand, I share the frustration of the authors, Rajan and Lamba, about the sort of the manufacturing sector and the fact that it has not, one way or the other, it has not expanded enough to bring in low-skilled workers at a faster pace. And is it possible that the services sector is able to pick up some of that? Are there certain types of jobs where a low-skilled worker exiting a farm is able to do just as well, meaning just at the same wage in kind of a low-skilled service sector position relative to low-skilled manufacturing? Perhaps, right? My broad thought on this is I don't see the need for us, for the question to be framed as it sometimes is, for the question to be framed as an either-or proposition. Should it be manufacturing? Should it be services? By all means, if there are service sectors that can, take up some of the youth that are entering the labor market, great. If there are some obstacles to service sector growth in India, and the government could sort of look at these and sort of make life easier for the services sector, let the government do that. If there are other business opportunities where low-skilled workers or medium-skilled or high-skill are needed in the service sector, let that take place. At the same time, I don't see why we should be either writing off the manufacturing sector or not thinking actively about the manufacturing sector as another potential sort of space, a sector where young Indians, low skill, medium skill, high skill, whatever it is, find gainful employment, right? So from my perspective, let's not treat this as an either-or proposition. Whatever it is that from a policy perspective needs to be done, whether it's infrastructural support, whether it's deregulation of labor markets, of kind of other factor markets, land and so forth, whatever needs to be done, let that continue. My worry a bit is this excessive focus on the services sector might take the pressure off of policymakers in thinking about what is necessary to be done in the manufacturing sector. I think some progress has been made over the last decade or so in sort of pushing some reforms there. And let's not say to them, hey, forget about the manufacturing sector. Let's move on to services. The other thing I would add as a kind of as a point in this is that the situation is not as hopeless as some authors make it out to be. And I'm not referring to Rajan and Lamba here. I'm not sure quite what their point might be on this. But there's an argument out there that, look, the manufacturing sector has exhausted itself. China's already taken up, the lion's share of manufacturing, production. And so now that China is there, and now that Korea is still there, and now that Vietnam is there, and so forth, there's going to be very little left for India to do, right? This is an old discussion, and you and I, I'm sure you remember that even before China entered the picture, the same argument was made, saying, listen, now that the Japanese are here, the Koreans are here, there's no room for anybody else to enter. But China did enter, and entered very successfully, and engineered a very successful transformation of its own economy. So that's one point. I don't think the story is completely over yet, right? Second is, even in the most recent years, so COVID, post-COVID years, you've actually seen some interesting shifts in the location of production in Asia. So within Asia, away from China to Vietnam, away from China a bit to Bangladesh, and so on and so forth, which also tells you that this continues to be, within manufacturing, continues to be a dynamic space. I think we ought to be looking at ourselves as a country to ask why it is that we haven't been able to make the transformation ourselves. And maybe there's some good answers there.
No, absolutely. And I think again, I'm going to kind of fold my reply into the next question, Pravin, which is that, that raises an interesting question. You say, it's not an either or, and kind of larger conceptual question is, to what extent should the governments set a level playing field and then let market forces determine, what investments go where, what workers go where. Whereas the contrary view would be that it requires an active policy of picking winners, sometimes called industrial policy. So that's actually a perfect segue to my next broader question, Pravin, which is, in fact, India's reforms, perhaps not by coincidence, marks the beginning of our present era of globalization. So, most scholars looking at it would date the early 1990s, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and now the entry of, range of countries in Eastern Europe into as liberal democracies and into the market economy, into global trade. India is opening up elsewhere in Asia. And then, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself and all of its former satellite states becoming independent and joining the global economy. Sort of the height of what is sometimes called the Washington Consensus, controversial term, but basic idea being that, essentially you want to liberalize trade, liberalize investment. And of course, we can have a more nuanced debate about whether there's an asymmetry. As you know, economists as different as Bhagwati and Joe Stiglitz have argued that there's a fundamental asymmetry between liberalizing goods trade and financial liberalization. So we could talk about that. But the basic premise was that government set the rules of the game, and then step back and sort of let private entrepreneurs and the market decide where investment flows, where jobs are created. And now in the last couple of years, we're seeing what many view as a turning away from that fundamental premise of globalization. And what I find striking is that there's been remarkable continuity, say, between Trump and Biden in the US, who are very dissimilar, obviously, radically so in many other ways. But it's been quite extraordinary that Biden's trade and industrial policy essentially took over the Trump playbook, burnished it a bit, changed the names of programs, such as the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so on. With an explicit push towards industrial policy, towards protection, premised on national security. We've got to kind of de-risk from China, and the friendshoring, all of the terms that are thrown around. And of course, and we've seen now China slowing down. So this raises a very big question, not just for India, but for the global South, as it's now called more generally, because trade and investment and so on have been the engines of growth. And if now the rich countries of the West or the North, led by the US, are kind of losing their nerve, if you want to put it that way, about globalization and the benefits that flow from that, for all countries. How do you see that? Is my view too pessimistic? Is this just kind of a minor turning in the road, or are we actually kind of turning back now on globalization at the level of kind of the major countries of the world? But let's say, obviously, US being the largest, Pravin.
Yeah, great questions, Vivek. Let me, and for me, so, on the one hand, there's an attempt to sort of, in my mind, to try and find one single argument or one broad argument that might sort of provide an explanation for why you're seeing some of these things take place simultaneously in different parts of the world. But let me break that down into something smaller, right? So I don't think I or others have been successful in kind of thinking about one single argument that gets to this. But in the US, I think that, so first of all, you very rightly observed that one of the more surprising, potentially quote unquote surprising sort of facts is how little the Biden administration did once they came into power to reverse or overturn the various sort of policies in the trade and industrial policy space that the Trump administration had put, right? But I would like, just to understand the dynamics within the United States first, I would like to take us back maybe another step, right? So if you think back to Trump's predecessors, so we're really talking about the Obama administration, right? The Obama administration too, although they spoke about things differently and had a certain sophistication and style with the way they presented themselves with respect to these arguments, it was definitely the case that this sort of reluctance about globalization, the reluctance to openly support globalization, was prevalent during the Obama presidential campaigns as well, and certainly during the administration. And for me, the point here goes even deeper. So if you look back at the last 4 or 5 presidents and presidential races, in the US, there have been a handful of states that have determined the outcome. So you're really talking about the deindustrialized, or quote unquote deindustrialized states of the US, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, Wisconsin, and so on. And you could throw Florida in there, not as a deindustrialized state, but another swing state. Okay? And so from the standpoint of presidential politics, it's been very important to deal with these states and to get them to support you. So this is Clinton administration, this is the Bush administration that followed, Obama administration that followed that, Biden, and so on. So very, very careful about how these states are perceived. The one thing that Trump did very cleverly and understood very cleverly was that by sort of framing the narrative in this way, talking about these deindustrialized states as being the victims of globalization, that one could get a large number of voters there in these very important states to support you, right? And I don't think that lesson was lost on the Democrats. So the continuity in policy between Trump and Biden, and for that matter, Hillary Clinton, who was Trump's opponent, the positioning that the position that she took during her campaign was not too different from the way Trump talked about it. Of course, he was more aggressive and he was more pushy with respect to this point, but they're not very different from the standpoint of just presidential politics and strategy, right? So for me, I guess what I'm trying to say there is that on the one hand, there are economic issues and economic competition with China and continued U.S. supremacy and concerns about U.S. supremacy. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a kind of a much more cynical, narrow, sort of self-interested politics at play, and I think that plays a very important part and explains to a good extent why it was that the Biden administration did not reverse the sets of things that Trump did. To put a number on it, I think the Trump administration, just kind of the various trade taxes that they had on between the steel taxes, the aluminum taxes, various other taxes on the Europeans, the Indians, Chinese, and so on, it amounted to maybe around $300 billion or so worth of goods, imports that were subject to new Trump taxes. And of those 300 billion, I believe it's only less than $10 billion that the Biden administration has sort of actively worked on to reverse. So it's like 290, most of it is still there, right? The second is that there is definitely a new mood in Washington with respect to what one feels with respect to geopolitics and the competition with China and so on. And that maybe the one thing left in DC that Republicans and Democrats appear to be agreeing on is that they both dislike China. So there's this kind of this broad bipartisan type support for this idea that maybe the US should do something very aggressive from an industrial policy standpoint. So for me, the US moved back from globalization, the US moved back from, moved towards industrial policy, CHIPS Act and various other things. This is all part of this package on the one hand of domestic politics, and on the other hand about this sort of very live concern about where they are in relation to China and the worry that maybe they were a little too liberal in allowing China to join the WTO on sort of relatively liberal terms and in terms of their own technological collaborations and so forth that maybe enable China to accelerate its growth relative to what maybe they had anticipated. In the rest of the world, when we think about, when we think about countries like India, India too has pushed aggressively recently with industrial policy measures of its own. Most notably, the production-linked incentive scheme, which is a very large scheme, I believe about $30 billion worth over a period of 5 years. And so that's a new form of, new type, at least, round 2 or round 3 or round 5 of industrial policy that's being tried in India of this type, right? I have two thoughts. One is that very clearly it cannot be the case that you transform an economy altogether based on industrial policy ideas of this type, where the government has a bunch of subsidy money and it's allocating it to particular industries, and if you produce in this industry, this is how much we give you, and so forth. That cannot be the thing that takes India down this path that we would like for it to go on, towards more manufacturing and high-tech manufacturing and so on. That being said, we started in a position so close to zero relative to China, right? So if you look at the FDI that's piled into China for the last 2-3 decades and where they are, and the footprint of American companies and other international European companies in there, Japanese, South Korean, and so on, and the scale of manufacturing there, we're so far behind that maybe the idea that India could even potentially compete, that it's potentially maybe a different place now, it's an attractive place, more attractive than it used to be 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that you could actually do something here, needed that kind of nudge where the Indian government kind of comes in there and says, listen, let's just have a few big players like an Apple, like somebody else, like Boeing or General Motors or whoever else, General Electric. Let's find a way to subsidize their entry so that they're able to come. There's some kind of a demonstration effect here. And other companies in the rest of the world are able to see that large, sophisticated, important players like Apple have entered and are successful, and are able to report back to whoever that India is a reasonable place in which to do business as well. So maybe there's something to that strategy. Can we afford $30 billion? It's not a small sum. It's not the biggest sum in the world either. Can we stop with that? Once there's a demonstration fact that's potentially taken place along the lines of what we're hoping for, will the political economy of subsidies and rent seeking overwhelm everything else? Or would it be the case that the government somehow has the discipline to say, well, this is it. We've encouraged industries to come in, and this is going to be the end of it. Now everybody else that comes in does it because we've already leveled out the playing field, or we've improved the playing field, and so we're new productive space in which to do business. That would be a concern for me. We're not quite there yet at a point in time where we could be testing that proposition, or whether that kind of tough discipline that's needed to be maintained in order not to have industrial policy just overwhelm and destroy the whole economy. But I'm certainly hopeful now that the policies have already been announced and some of this production's already taken place. I hope for India's sake that will be the case.
No, there's again a lot to unpack there, but just a couple of observations or remarks, and then I'll kind of throw it into kind of a final question your way, Pravin. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, India has now gone through several phases of industrial policy. I mean, you think back to 2014, within a few months, one of Mr. Modi's first big schemes was Make in India. I remember it was maybe in October. I was in fact in Vancouver, and I watched him unveil this new scheme. So in some sense, India was perhaps ahead of the curve among major countries in the global South in kind of pivoting explicitly towards some kind of industrial policy, which at that time I was a columnist for the Mint and was worrying that this could kind of degenerate into old-fashioned protectionism. And one should add that the track record of industrial policy, over time, and you've worked on this and maybe all learned this, isn't terribly good. So it seems that kind of yet every new generation thinks that they can do it better, they can get it right, not be captured by rent seeking and the politics around it. That's just one observation. On the US, absolutely a very good reminder that the protectionist turn or the loss of faith in free trade and globalization, either for just the reason of sheer electoral politics, you correctly point out, again, many non-Americans don't understand this, that, with the kind of first past the post, state by state electoral college system, in the end, it's a few voters in a few swing states, the so-called purple states that are not fully red or not fully blue, and many are the kind of these Rust Belt states are decisive, and that politics is appealing both to both major parties. And in fact, going back to Obama, as you said, in fact, I think he began kind of in his time gumming up the works of the WTO, long before Trump was even on the national scene. And of course, go back to Clinton, go back to the great 1992 presidential election campaign when you and I were students studying international trade.
Exactly.
And that famous debate between Bush Senior, Clinton, and Ross Perot talking about giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. And that's really quite striking, that even just as globalization, as we now know it, was being born in some sense, there were already these misgivings and debates going on kind of in the heartland of the global economy, the US. So that's a very good reminder. And and in some ways, the debates that we're having now or that happened in 2016 are similar in some important ways to the debate that the US was having in 1992, in somewhat different garb, different language. So that's quite striking. And so perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised then that there has been this continuity in the turn away from kind of from let's say fair and free trade. Just
And
one.
if you'll recall,
Sure.
Vivek, there was a moment there in the Obama during the Obama election. So when he beat out, I think it was John McCain. Um, there was a moment there where I think he was campaigning in Ohio and he was speaking very strongly against the North American Free Trade Agreement or something of that nature. And there was some concern expressed, I think, by Canadians even about what exactly was going on in the U.S. race. And Austin Goolsbee, a professor at Chicago, who was an advisor to the campaign, privately commented, I think it was to the Canadian ambassador, gave a private comment saying, "Don't worry about this. This is just election posturing, and we'll pivot right back as soon as Obama is in office." And the Canadian ambassador, promptly reported it back to the authorities in Canada, and somehow this was leaked, and Goolsbee was, told to sort of simmer down. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, they kept him out of public view for the rest of the election campaign. So even back then, it was very clear that in order to win elections, you needed to position yourself a certain way. And at least in Obama's case, his view was maybe once he came into office that he could pivot away from that position towards a more, kind of open-minded or internationalist position, whereas Trump took a different view. So not only was his election campaign against globalization, his actions too very rapidly moved in that direction.
Yeah, and whatever one may say about Trump, I mean, he did actually do or try to do what he said he was going to do in the campaign. Right. So there's a certain level of consistency. Whether we think the policies are good or not, probably most economists or free trade economists disagree. Kind of just one last question, Pravin, on the geopolitics. And again, I'm harking back to our conversation 10, 12 years ago, where we were talking about at that time, I think, in that conversation, maybe a bit ahead of the curve, talking about the changing India-US relationship in terms of global geopolitics, because China was already becoming a concern, but was not kind of top of mind or not, on center stage. And of course, that has dramatically increased in the last couple of years. So, it's now become just a cliche almost to say that the US and the West needs India as a counterweight, as a kind of global democratic counterweight that shares Western values and so on to an increasingly bellicose authoritarian China. But beyond the level kind of cliches and slogans like that, ultimately kind of India's interests seem to me to be quite different from that of the US. I mean, India, for example, has not, and like many countries of the global South, has not taken a position on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They say this is a, kind of European colonial war. We don't want to get mixed up in this. Similarly on the crisis in the Middle East, Israel, Hamas. So is it realistic to expect for the US to expect that India is kind of just going to be happy to kind of come along for the ride with the US and what the West wants to do? Or would it be more realistic to say that India will engage strategically with the West, but also to continue to engage with Russia, which is an important source of course, for India, oil, gas, so on. And India, of course, also has its problems with China, the unresolved border dispute. So how do you see the geopolitics, particularly the India-US dynamic playing out, and kind of at a level deeper than the cliches that we're now hearing all the time?
So of course some of this is sort of pure politics and geopolitics, and that may be well above my pay grade as an economist. But my sense of this is that India clearly seems to be quite keen on maintaining its strategic autonomy, and I think that's for the best. Indian interests are what they are, and Indian authorities should be sort of calculating their own national interests and calculating strategies and tactics based on, maximizing that. So that's on the one hand. On the other, I think for greater US-India cooperation to take place and to be fruitful and productive on the sets of things that both sides seek, I think the question of whether or not they agree on some other issues might not be so important. So, should India take a particular view with respect to Israel and Hamas and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which has had a long history, and India's had its own history in terms of its engagement with this issue? Is India's support or kind of, 100% alignment with the U.S. on what the U.S. is thinking on this issue? Is that necessary for the U.S.? Perhaps not. Likewise, with Russia, I mean, I think even there was kind of narrative out there early on in the conflict that India was somehow undermining the West's efforts by continuing to purchase oil from Russia and so on. But I think over time it became very clear that had India not been doing that, if the sanctions on Russian oil had in fact been very successful, the increase in the oil prices in the world would have been so dramatic, and coming on top of the already kind of raging inflation at that point in the US and other Western countries would have been extremely challenging. And I would suspect that at least privately, that U.S. officials were reasonably relaxed and maybe even quite happy that sales from Russia were going to India, so that you didn't have a kind of a genuine oil price crisis hit the economy at the same time as so many other things were taking place. So my sense is there's never going to be 100% alignment. There's never going to be 100% cooperation. There's perhaps never going to be 100% trust. But a lot of that is not maybe necessary for a good deal of cooperation to take place and for lots of things to be achieved of the sort that India wants on the one hand, of the sort that the United States wants on the other, and of the sort that sort of the private sector in both these economies would want from the governments of the two sides, right? So, and I think somehow I'm happy to see that both sides have been smart or wise enough to separate these things in a way that disagreements over Russia policy or disagreements over Israel policy, such as they might be, have not sort of interfered with what other good things could be achieved through cooperation and discussions.
So I think on that hopeful note of India-US, hopefully they won't have to wait another 10 years to revisit where we're at. But on behalf of both, of myself and all of the viewers, my students and the world out there watching on YouTube, I want to thank you for your insights, Pravin. It's been great to have you on the show and have this wonderful conversation.
Real pleasure. Pleasure is all mine, Vivek. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pravin. Thank you, Pravin.